Hey now, Brawlers, it's time for another Board Game Brawl review with Nick Minahan, sponsored by BoardGameBliss.com.
Hey now, today we're going to take a look at the North American English version of Mysterium. Now, you may recall, if you've been watching the channel, that I already reviewed a version of Mysterium, the original one from Portal Games, the Polish version, which has a name I will not try to pronounce because it would end up offending the Polish people, and I really don't want to do that. But the takeaway from that was that I really enjoyed Mysterium, one of my favorite games from last year, and I really had no issues with it. It was a very beautiful looking game. But the company Libelud, which I also am probably mispronouncing, subsidiary of Asmodee, put out a North American English version of it that debuted at Gen Con and will be hitting general release very soon, I think, that had a graphical makeover and also had a few extra rules and extra components in order to make the game a little more user-friendly. So I was very curious to see what this new edition would be like and to see if it's better than the original edition, the same, worse, whatever that case might be. There's other versions of the game too. There's an Italian version, a Russian version, and they're all slightly different from each other. But I'm only referring to the Polish version and the new English version of it. So let me go ahead and show you what comes with this new edition of the game. I'm not going to go over all of the core rules because the core mechanisms of both versions of the game are exactly the same. So I'm going to have a link when the overview starts to my previous review of the Polish version if you really want to know all the nuts and bolts of how Mysterium works. But I do want to show you all the new components, some of the new rules, and also just show off some of the new artwork just to give you a taste of what this edition is like. Then we're going to come back and I'll let you know what I think of this whole new package. Okay, I just want to quickly show you the new stuff in the North American English version of Mysterium. If you want to know how to play the full game with all the core rules, go and watch my original review of the Polish version, which I will link to, because the core mechanisms of both games are exactly the same. I just want to show you the new additional rules and components for this edition. So, first and foremost, I suppose it's the elephant in the room here, is this Dungeon Master screen, which is usable by the Ghost player. Now, what this is for is that when you, and again, this is assuming you know how to play the game, when you set up the beginning of the game and you randomize and choose the proper set of cards for every player, you are going to put them in the little plastic sleeves on this dungeon screen, and it will have images of person, location, and object for each player. Every vertical column represents a player, and you will actually have these little tokens that you'll put at the bottom of the screen to remind yourself of which player it is. These are also color-coded on the screen themselves. But you can also use these tokens to remind yourself like who you've already given cards to and so on. Although, I don't know, I think it's kind of easy to see who you've already interacted with in the rounds. But regardless, you have that. And then as you finish cards, as they guess correctly, you can flip them over to this side and keep them in their screen. Now, on the top of the screen, perched here, are these little crow tokens. And the crow tokens, all they are reminders of how many discards you as the ghost have left for this game. If you don't recall, because that was sort of an ancillary thing in the original game, depending on the difficulty level and the number of players, the ghost player has a certain number of full hand discards of the vision cards that they can just dump their entire hand and redraw back up to 7. That's another change too, is I think the original game was only 6 cards you usually drew. But anyways, these crows just represent your reminders of that. So every time you use the discard ability during the course of the game, get rid of one of your crows depending on how many you have. Speaking of those vision cards, there is a whole deck of vision cards, and I apologize because I filmed my final thoughts first, and I forgot to talk about the vision cards because one of the bummers of this new edition is that all of the vision cards are exactly the same artwork as the original Polish and Italian and Russian versions of the game. Now, it's not that they're bad. They're fantastic. It's like phenomenal artwork. But it would have been nice to have new cards with new artwork so that if you did have more than one set like I do, you can mix them all together. But that would have been very prohibitive cost-wise. It's like a whole new set of 70, 80 pieces of art. So I totally understand why they didn't do that. And you can still use Dixit cards, essentially, if you really wanted to have variety. to the cards. If you have Dixit cards like I do, then that wouldn't really be an issue. But those are your vision cards, same as they were before. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. Let's go out to the setup here. I set this up assuming a full 7-player game just to have as many cards out on the table as possible. And these are all, I believe, I'm pretty darn sure these are all new artwork. All of the items, all of the locations, all of the character cards. Fantastic artwork from Xavier Collette. That's another thing I got wrong in my final thoughts. I thought that Xavier Collette was Nayade, but really that's Xavier Jeffrey Durin, who is, I believe that's his name, who is Nayade. Anyways, too many Xaviers. But really great artwork. And a few other things here. You'll notice there's these little pedestals next to each set of cards. The person cards, the location cards, and the item cards. These are where you will stow. These will not only delineate which set of cards is which, but you can stow your intuition markers for the players here. And by the way, that's new too, unless you had the, I think, Italian version of the game, which came with orbs that were either the same or very similar as these. But these take the place of the wooden discs from the Polish version. These are just the reminders for which cards the players are selecting during the course of the game. And actually, they're a good way to tell which player is at which level, because those markers, like let's say blue guesses their card correctly, they will go up to the next level and put their marker here to remind themselves of that. Speaking of which, if as you guess cards correctly in this game, as one of the psychic investigators, each player has a little sleeve. The sleeve not only has a picture of their character and reminds themselves of what color they are, but they will stow the cards, the location, the object, and the person that they guess correctly into their sleeve for safekeeping, because that is important for the end of the game. We'll get back to that. Other new components in the game. Instead of a wooden marker used to keep track of the rounds, you have this cool 3D clock, which doesn't really require much assembly. It's a pretty neat thing. You'll just move the hour hands to keep track of how many rounds are left in the game. There's we'll get to this in a second. There is a timer in the game now, which was always an optional thing in the beginning, in the first game, really. And it is useful. If players are taking too long to deduct, then you can flip the timer on them to get them going. But I would say it's purely optional. You don't really need to use it. Let's see, what do I want to cover next? Okay, let's just jump right into what is probably the elephant in the room. And that is this whole track over here, which is called the Clairvoyance track, and these little colored nubs corresponding to the players, and more importantly, all of these stacks of tokens, which also correspond to each of the players. Now, you're going to get a certain number of those tokens depending on the number of players in the game. In fact, if you play with too few players, you won't use those at all. I think if you play with 3 players, you just won't do that. So what these are essentially betting tokens. Each player is going to have a set of these, and these tokens are going to have either, let me see if I can show you here, where are we? Sorry, too focused in. You're going to have either a X sign, meaning incorrect, or a check mark, meaning correct. You are essentially betting with these tokens. When the investigators do their normal putting their intuition markers out on cards to guess the clues of the vision cards that were given to them by the ghost, at the same time, the investigators may throw down as many markers as they want, check mark or incorrect, on a card. You yourself, as one player, can only put one of your markers down on a card per turn, but you can place as many on as many cards as you want. But any number of players can play one token on the same card per turn. You are essentially betting whether or not you think your fellow psychic, you can't put them on your own cards that you guessed, but you're betting whether your fellow psychic guessed correctly or incorrectly. Now, why would you want to be right in either of those cases? Because if you do guess right, one way or the other, you get to move your little nub up this clairvoyance track. Everyone starts off at 0, then it goes up like that. And whether you are right or wrong, your used tokens go back to these discard piles underneath the clock, which means they're one-time use whether you got it right or whether you got it wrong. Now, this board here, when everyone finishes with all of their cards, if someone finishes their entire set of 3 cards, guessing them, they will move their intuition marker to that board, showing that they are done. And in fact, if they finish early, for every round that's left on the clock, they get to move their little nub up an additional space. Now, stay with me here. Let's say that everyone finishes their set and there's still at least one round left. In typical Mysterium fashion, it gets down to the guess for the final culprit. Now, in the original game, there was a variant as to how you can play the final culprit. The normal way to play was that you would take all of the culprit cards that people had guessed, ignore all the location cards and all the object cards that people had guessed, and you would have everyone in the game have one final communal dream, where you're going to deal out as many vision cards as you want per the normal rules down to the table, and then players had to correspond them to whoever the real culprit was. But there was a variance in the original rules, which is the main rule for this version of the game, which is, when it gets down to the final culprit, every player is going to take all the cards that they put in their sleeve, the object, the location, and the culprit, lay them out in a row or a column in the center of the table with one of their markers denoting which one is theirs. Or actually, no, I'm sorry. That's something to do with these tokens here, the number tokens. You'll put those out to denote which one is which numbered set, whatever it is. And then the ghost player is going to take exactly 3 of his vision cards and put them face down in the center of the table. One vision card is going to be for one of the locations, the correct location. One of them is going to be for the correct culprit, and one of them is going to be for the correct item. All 3 of them are placed face down as clues. Then you're going to refer to that clairvoyance track. Wherever each player is on the clairvoyance track, see those little card symbols there at 0, 7, and 10? And by the way, the board is double-sided, so the other side is for a different number of players. But at 0, 7, and 10, whoever got to those points, that's how many cards they get to look at. So first you'd see, well, how many people only got to 0 or 6, and therefore can only look at one card? They get to look at one of the cards, and they must relate them to something out there amongst every set of cards. Then you get to 7, and you get to look at 2. Whatever players got to that point get to look at 2 of the cards. And whoever got to 10 gets to look at 3 of the cards, and so on. And then you all discuss and deduce and try to figure out which is the real set. I know that's hard to describe without actually tearing all this down and showing you, but basically what it is just the final culprit guess, but now you have to get all 3 cards correct. The right object, the right location, the right person, and whoever does best with the little clairvoyance betting chip thing during the course of the game is going to get to look at more cards and therefore be more useful to the team. It almost sounds like it's competitive. It's not. It's just another element to make it harder for the investigators and to make you guys want to work harder to look at these cards and therefore make better guesses in the final round. But that's it. I mean, other than that, the core game is still the same. There's just all these little extra added elements and components which don't change the game at all. They just make it easier to keep track of things and make the ghost job easier of referring to the cards constantly during the course of the game. That is the new edition of Mysterium for English audiences. Let's get to my final thoughts. So as I mentioned in my intro, I already knew that I liked Mysterium, and there's nothing in this new edition that hurts my opinion of this game. This is a very solid, enjoyable game. It mixes Dixit with Clue, but the end result of that is a whole unique thing that just feels different than any other cooperative game that I've played. It's very cool, rich, I would say thematic experience. Sometimes it just feels like you're playing cards and just doing some simple deduction, but if you really want to, you could really get into that theme. So I still enjoy this edition as much as I enjoyed the previous edition, but do I like it more for some of the added stuff that's there? Well, as I showed, there are graphical changes. I wouldn't necessarily say enhancements, because I actually think that the artwork on the original edition of the game is awesome. It was really, really solid, and I had no issues with it. Now, the artist that they use for the new edition, the English edition, is one of my favorite artists, Xavier Collette. And so also goes by the name Nayade, who is awesome. It's totally awesome. So I was really looking forward to this artwork as well, and I think it is really good, but again, I'm comparing it to other artwork that is still really good. So that's a lateral shift. I could have gone with either of them. I think I like this maybe slightly better, but no big deal. That's going to be up to your personal preferences, but they both have the same tone, a sort of haunting thing. Xavier's artwork might look a little more cartoonish, but not to like a huge degree. But let's talk about the components. The components, I think, are the big differentiating factor for me personally, because the addition of the ghost screen, where you can put the clue cards of the culprit, the location, the item, differentiated by player and color, that is, to me, is the best change in this game. And while that is something you could probably rig up for yourself if you have another edition of the game, and to be very clear, I'm saying as a whole here, if you've already got a previous edition of Mysterium, you don't need to run out and buy this one. If you don't have a version of Mysterium, this would be the one to get because of these component changes. It just makes it so much easier to keep track of those cards, rather than like lifting up the piles that you would have to make in the previous versions of the game that didn't have the screen. It's also easier to... The clock is like just a fancy thing that's more for thematic sense, but it is actually easier to turn the hands of the clock than just to move a disc around, which I think is how it was done before. The sleeves that hold the cards is also a neat thing that is actually unnecessary unless you're playing with the variant of the final culprit thing, which I'll talk more about in a second, in the original game. So that's an okay addition. And also the little boards that you put between each level of cards that you have to figure out as the psychics, that is, again, unnecessary, but it's nice. It's nice to be able to say, okay, let's put your spheres back here, and then here's where you're getting ready to go back out onto the cards that you are going to make a guess on. Also, that's another cool thing too, is that in the original edition of the game, I think only the Italian version had those cool intuition spheres. And I don't know if they're exactly the same or not, but they added those into this version, and they just look better. Again, it's a more thematic thing, not strictly necessary, but it's certainly better than the colored wooden discs. So all of that, I think, is solid as far as the components, and that would be a major reason to go with this version over the other one, because the art is equal, but the components make the game a little more user-friendly. Talking about the new rules, though, and this is what most people who had already played the original are most curious about. Nothing that is new here as far as the rules is necessary. And in fact, I want to play more with them just to figure out for sure whether or not I, am into them or not. But for right now, I'm going to say totally unnecessary. You could skip them, and definitely not a reason to get this version of the game if that's all that you're worried about. The whole thing with the clairvoyance tokens, I like the premise of it. First off, it's predicated on the fact that you're going to be doing that variant, which you could have done with the original version, where instead of just having everyone have a communal final vision as if it was a normal vision you would give to one of the players during the game, you take everyone's cards, which now can be put neatly into those sleeves that they've been guessing the whole game, make the rows of them, and then have the 3 cards referring to the real object, location, and person amongst those choices. I think I was saying 3, but depending on the number of players, however many that might be. And then those are face down, but players who got... One of them is going to be face up, but players who got to a certain point on this clairvoyance board will get to look at the other cards. And your progress on that track is kept track of by these clairvoyance markers that you essentially bet on. You bet on whether people are correctly or incorrectly guessing these different cards during the course of the game. It's interesting. It's a nice thought. It adds some cumbersome elements to a game that really doesn't need to be more cumbersome. It really doesn't. Part of what I liked about Mysterium originally was that, yes, it was, in the original, it was more of a pain for the setup for the ghost and to be constantly looking at those cards. But once you got through that, it's pretty simple. You're just guessing, and it's supposed to be simple. That's what I liked about it. Adding this extra element, while interesting, while it makes it more of a gamerly game, I don't think it actually adds to the enjoyment of the game. I think it's just another thing to worry about, and I would say the game is tough enough, too. Because with that, you're essentially modifying the difficulty. And I don't think it needs to be. I think you could either do it the way it was originally written in the original version's rules, which is to say that you just have one final communal dream the same way you would have guessed on any of the cards before, Or you just have everyone's, you do it like that, where you have everyone's guest cards at the end, making use of those sleeves, but then you just have everyone see all 3 cards. And I still think the game would be pretty difficult at that point, depending on the number of players, without having to go through this whole rigmarole of the clairvoyance board. But the cool thing is, you can take that or leave it. It's totally modular. You don't have to do it. The core of the game is still very, very good. Any version of the game looks beautiful, and this version's components that help facilitate the ghost's actions are very welcome. So again, let me just clarify. If you don't have a version of Mysterium, this is the one to get. If you've already got a previous version of Mysterium, you don't need to get this one unless you just don't want to rig up your own cool components to help the ghost. And even if you don't do that, it doesn't matter. It's still a very good game either way. So I like Mysterium a lot, and I'm happy to see that it is reaching a wider audience. That is Mysterium, the North American English edition from Asmodee and Libelud. I've never said that correctly in my life. I will try better next time.
Thanks for watching. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. And make sure to check out our sponsor, Board Game Bliss, where you can find an amazing selection of games from around the world. BoardGameBliss.com. Thanks for your support.